Marek, welcome back to the podcast. You will be pleased to know that you now are at the top of the rankings for the number of appearances on the Health Path podcast.
Okay, nice. Well, it's nice to set a record before midday. So, yeah, it's a good start.
Yeah, absolutely. No pressure at all. We've obviously talked about for thyroid, we've talked about adrenal function previously. Today's topic is all about estrogen. And because you are a regular to the podcast, I think we'll kind of miss the intros and the backgrounds. I think people will be familiar with you, your work, how you think, etc. So we can kind of dive straight in, I guess, ultimately. So to throw the ball into your court, how would you like to introduce this topic around estrogen?
Okay, well, I guess, yeah, let's give it a subtitle. I think the subtitle is the hormone that is the most active in the brain and one of the most active in energy management, but also the hormone that undoubtedly is the most misunderstood.
I like that subtitle. Would you like to expand on these points, Marek?
Well, gladly. Yeah, let's yeah provide subheadings to that subtitle. So, yeah, brain-wise, estrogen's very interesting factor there. So we've got direct connections between the activity of serotonin and dopamine receptors, but equally so many indirect effects via the way the estrogen provides this energy signal into the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus being that part of the brain that manages our homeostasis, constantly measuring our temperature, hydration status, energy availability, hormonal balance, so on and so forth. But yeah, whereas we often think of estrogen as something to overcome for weight loss or something to manage when it comes to PMT or painful periods, etc. Well, actually, yeah, it does play a massive role in brain health, and that impact at the hypothalamus can have massive impacts, not just on the how permission is provided to various areas of the brain, but also how permission is provided to tons of energy intensive processes throughout the body. So a bit of a lighting up effect we can expect there. On top of that, yeah, when it comes to energy management, I've already alluded to a little bit of that, but its effects at the hypothalamus zone have such a big impact on basal metabolic rate. Meanwhile, its impact at the fat cells can have such a huge impact as to where does the energy go. And this is where there are two types of receptors that we'll see at fat cells, especially in females. Yes, they exist in men, but for females, they have a whole lot more of this estrogen receptor beta, which not only will we discuss in the way it can cause problems with people's weight loss goals, but equally how it can play a protective role, has an impact in cardiovascular health. And its role, especially when lined up against the role of estrogen receptor alpha, well, that I think is where we see the biggest misunderstandings when it comes to estrogen. This 1990s idea that estrogen is a female fat storage hormone. Well, it just doesn't pan out in reality. And there's plenty of examples we can look at there, including those examples in the literature. But I would introduce that discussion by just considering this: if it's a fat storage hormone, why does almost every single woman who goes through menopause gain weight? So yeah, that would be my introduction. So yeah, what feels like a good place to start picking apart?
Oh, I mean, all of it ultimately. That's, I think, a really great introduction. And areas that I think certainly the public may just not yet be aware of when we think of estrogen as having such a key role in the brain and from a sort of an energy perspective. But with, I guess, a subset of our customers really struggling from an energy perspective, sort of starting to unpick that side of thing and some of the mechanisms that you're aware of, I think would be amazing.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, in that regard, yeah, I think sometimes these things are best understood first by stepping back, and in that regard, considering that evolutionary role of estrogen. And obviously, there's a huge connection there to fertility, which is the only means through which humans can reproduce. That is ultimately the genetic goal encoded into each strand of DNA that we hold. And in that regard, there is that worthwhile question to enter this area, which is given estrogen's role in achieving that evolutionary goal, well, when might lower or alterations in the estrogen activity be appropriate? That is to say, yeah, when might it be appropriate to just hold back on these evolutionary goals? And that's where the role of energy, resources really comes to the fore. Because as much as, yes, this is the goal of all living species to reproduce and to ultimately confer children and grandchildren that will go on to inhabit the earth, well, it's also something that in humans is going to take up 9.5 months of a huge energy drain. There's nothing that can be more of a sustained stress on the system than growing a human being. That's a pretty energy intensive task. And so that's where there makes a lot of sense from evolutionary purposes to link energy availability, as in the energy that we're going to need to go through that sort of process, with the defined end goals of estrogen. And of course, they're very, very linked.
Beautiful. I love that kind of concept of bringing it back to the evolutionary purposes of these things, because that really does start to connect in with some of these, I just say, imbalances, no matter if we're talking about estrogen or other areas of health, like when we spoke about adrenal function and thyroid function, for example, as having at times this sort of adaptive response, I guess, and then that sometimes becoming maladaptive as well.
Well, exactly that, because I think so often when we talk about estrogen, we're talking about getting it out, getting it down, pushing it low. And the question that I always think is worth putting forward at this point is, well, why is it high in the first instance? Do we think that it's because some sort of regulation in the body has just broken down? Or is there a reason for it? Is this healthy and evolutionarily designed response to the conditions that are currently present in the body, or at least the signals that here the hypothalamus is receiving? So yeah, that's where yeah, just recognizing, well, what does the human body want to do in these situations, and then what are we seeing play out, rather than assuming it's broken and let's just slam the usual supplements at it to get estrogen down, which won't surprise anybody to hear it doesn't work.
Okay. So I guess, unless there's an area that you want to sort of touch on, the question that comes to mind is kind of starting to explore, I guess, things and mechanisms that influence this. I got taught at the Institute for Functional Medicine this kind of acronym of PTSD. Is it a production issue? Is it a transport issue? Is it a sensitivity sort of cellular issue? Or is it a detox or sort of metabolism issue? Which I always think is kind of quite a nice structure, a way of thinking about what you've been saying there. Is it some regulatory mechanism that's broken down? Is it actually an adaptive response in the circumstances that person finds themselves, etc.? But I guess there are numerous branches that we can go down in with discussing how other bodily areas or physiology are interconnected here.
Definitely. And so, in that regard, there are huge connections between energy signaling, inflammation, and stress. As you might expect, these are the factors that influence how much resources we have, but also how many are stolen by the stress response or by the inflammatory response. So, of course, nothing can have a bigger impact on our resources than these main factors. So yeah, let's get on to that. But first, it's probably worth touching on one of those initials. We'll start with the D, because so often you do see advice given to women that they need to detox estrogen. The idea being that if they could just move it out better, if they could just get the liver to grab it and push it out in a little bit more force, that suddenly everything would be different. And it really doesn't take any account of the way that the regulation happens. And in that regard, what are we talking about? So for the purposes of being specific, I'm going to refer to the most common scenario, one that's often deemed estrogen dominance, wherein what we see is classically some signs associated with that pattern, especially PMT, painful periods. Maybe we'll also see some changes in well-being. At times estrogen's higher, most notably in these scenarios that second half of the cycle, so roughly days 13 to 27, aka the luteal phase. And often women will find that their well-being is affected. Maybe mood, sleep, concentration are the main areas that they can detect these changes. But in any case, in these scenarios, we'll often see either low progesterone and normalish levels of estrogen, and thus the estrogen is being unopposed, or we will see this other common pattern whereby estrogen levels in the blood are really high. And so, at first glance, that situation, it is intuitive that, hey, we've got high estrogen in the bloodstream, we've got all these estrogen linked symptoms, too much estrogen needs to get out, let's detox it. And so what we see is people being given resveratrol and DIM and calcium D-glucarate. Now, it's fair to say that there are times when these items can be useful. However, they just don't do what they're meant to in these circumstances. And I'll explain why. So the key thing here, if we're seeing high estrogen in the bloodstream, I'm going to go back to that question as to, well, why is that? What's regulating that? We know that at all times that the hypothalamus is constantly measuring how much estrogen it's receiving. And based on that, plus a comparison to how much estrogen it wants, that will determine whether it then chooses to send a stimulatory signal down to the ovaries. And it sends them in LH and FSH, luteinizing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone. They're released here by the pituitary, travel through the bloodstream, and request that the ovaries produce more estrogen, and they do. So whenever we're seeing this higher level of estrogen in the bloodstream, by definition, there has to be higher level of stimulation from the hypothalamus. So why would the hypothalamus want more estrogen? Well, in all cases, it's actually decidedly simple, because it's not receiving enough. And herein lies the key clue that we're going to expand on. If you've got normal levels of estrogen in the bloodstream, but your hypothalamus is behaving as if it's got very, very low levels, and therefore increasing the signal till estrogen goes high. What does that tell us about the sensitivity of that signaling back at the hypothalamus? There's clearly disturbances there. There's a loss of sensitivity, and that's a really big deal. And sure enough, this is where the literature demonstrates a very clear role for the estrogen receptor alpha as the primary receptor at that hypothalamus. Now, what's interesting is while that is the primary receptor at the hypothalamus, you've also got another estrogen receptor. In fact, you've got several types, but we're going to stick to the two main types right now, alpha and beta. Now, beta will be found in certain parts of the brain, specifically those areas involved in alertness, wakefulness, but it's very relevantly and for visual purposes, it's also found in the fat cells, especially those hips, buttocks, and under the arms, those areas located in these estrogen sensitive zones. It's got estrogen receptor alpha in those zones, but what's interesting about beta is that that's the receptor that encourages the movement of fats into the cell and reduces their ability to move back out of the cell. So let's call them for what they are. Estrogen receptor alpha encourages the investment of energy, encourages the increase in metabolic rate. The fat cells kicks out energy from those fat cells. Estrogen receptor beta encourages energy intake into those fat cells. It's the fat storage receptor. And suddenly we're starting to see why high blood levels of estrogen do tend to cause overactivity in the brain, difficulty sleeping, potentially affecting mood, and also increased fat storage in those key zones. But at the same time, we're not actually in a position where we should be calling this high estrogen activity, because the estrogen receptor alpha has become insensitive. And therefore, in order to get enough at the hypothalamus to keep the system happy, we're having to produce twice as much. So there's the P in the acronym. So this is where, we end up with lots in circulation as compensation. And therefore, what do we want to avoid if we want to avoid the downstream consequences of this setup? Well, we need to ensure that that estrogen receptor alpha remains sensitive. And this is where factors can stand in the way of such an aim, in particular stress and the inflammation. Those are two huge factors that can impact on this down regulation, and we can go into that however you so wish.
Amazing. Thank you, Marek. That was such a great breakdown and explanation of things. And it's interesting that we come back to stress and inflammation being big drivers of yet another feedback mechanism within the body, ultimately. And I guess from that perspective, we're starting to really come back to all the usual culprits when we think of what drives inflammation in the body.
Very much so. And I think that, hopefully one underlying message that can be extracted from the various podcasts that we've looked at is why, whenever I see individuals for that first time, whether we're looking at dealing with thyroid issues, or whether we're looking at eczema, or whether we're looking at difficulty sleeping, or whether we're looking at digestive issues, regardless of what our end goal is, before we get specific, it's so vital to take that bird's eye view of the situation in regards to in what way are energy signaling, inflammation, and stress issues contributing here? And then to work backwards from that point, because I have never, and I expect I will never see anybody with any chronic challenges for whom there isn't that three-way issue. There has got to be that ongoing issue for these problems to be sustained. And so the key question is, well, what's the individual factors that are contributing to keeping those problems going at the mitochondria, or in terms of insulin and thyroid signaling, all of which affect energy? Yeah, in terms of inflammation, is this something that is explained by dysbiosis in the gut, or are we looking at environmental issues, mold exposure and allergies, or are we looking at reactions to food chemicals, oxalates, lectins, etc.? Are we looking at endotoxemia, which of course is that middle ground between inflammation and stress? Because although you can get endotoxemia simply because of inflammatory damage driving oxidative stress at the gut lining and separating those cells, it's so important to acknowledge how stress also induces permeability in a different way. We're no longer separating the cells, which is that paracellular permeability. We're now creating a channel through the middle of each cell, transcellular permeability. And of course, it's there for a purpose. It's there to grab those sugars and salts so that we are better equipped to deal with the challenge that we are expecting. But it does come with a huge cost, and that's that ingress of those endotoxins, aka lipopolysaccharides, which are the breakdown products of dead bacteria. So little fragments that obviously cannot infect us because they are no longer a functional bacteria. They are just the fragments left over. But tragically, there's so much more bacterial DNA on display now, and that stimulates a massive inflammatory response from the body. And this is where, the inflammation generally can down-regulate that estrogen receptor alpha. But one of the most powerful mechanisms shown again and again in the literature is the lipopolysaccharides themselves. So we've got some real costs there should there be sustained disturbances in the gut. Real costs if there's any stress, be that the deeper emotional stress that will be carried with us everywhere we go, or whether that's the circumstantial stress load, the excess work and the work and financial pressures that most of us are facing, or whether that's energetic stress, insufficient calorie intake, or leaving longer gaps between meals, or difficulty getting that quality sleep, all of which can massively contribute. And I mention those just because, while I do understand why somebody might say, look, I'm going on holiday in 8 weeks' time and I want to lose X amount of kilograms, it's not necessarily what they want to hear for someone in my position to say, forget about this year. Let's actually deal with the underlying issues that make your aims impossible as things stand. Of course, once you remove the obstacles, it's a very different situation. But that's where, for every individual I've ever worked with who's been very keen on weight loss and has failed to see results from all the various protocols they've trialed so far, well, it doesn't take long to be able to quantify exactly where these obstacles are coming from, and what needs to be done about it. But obviously then comes the hard work of actually making those changes, and also the hard work of being patient while we tend to these underlying issues.
Yeah, and I think that's a really key point, the idea that you've got to restore harmony to this orchestra, so to speak, of the body, before you're going to actually really experience any results from that hard work. And I think that can be really frustrating, especially if you do have that kind of short-term goal coming up, like a holiday in 8 weeks' time. But something that I wanted to I just re-emphasize also is this really interesting connection between endotoxemia, LPS, and the receptors, because it's true for some of the thyroid receptors, I believe. I think it's true for kind of the glucocorticoid or the cortisol receptors. So I just think it's interesting that, these bacterial fragments from the gut, if they're getting through that leaky gut lining, can seem to influence all of the hormones that we've discussed on this podcast so far.
Absolutely. And this is where I think that we can just yield so much value and avoid so much frustration. And in that regard, what I'm talking about is the typical scenario where, yeah, an individual knows what they want to achieve, and yeah, the challenges that are limiting their enjoyment of life. And so, yeah, we see a whole number of different ideas out there, which in itself is a healthy thing. But when they get particularly dogmatic, when they're no longer anchored to realistic expectations and any sort of data to substratify our expectations, what we get is the situation we see repeatedly. Do this estrogen detox and lose 10 pounds in 10 days, etc. And the key problems are it's not going to happen. But even if it was for some, well, any plan that says this will be the outcome, regardless of who does it, has clearly not given themselves any opportunity to tailor the approach to tend to the obstacles unique to that individual. And in that regard, yeah, I will see tons of individuals who've been around the houses and have naturally been impressed by the idea that, do this, change that, use not just the supplements you've used before, but a better supplement. This is from a higher hill in a more exclusive jungle, and that's going to be, the real kicker. That's what's going to make the difference. Or alternatively, those that really dig into that psychological urge, the one that says, you know what, other programs didn't work because they didn't ask you to do enough. Well, this is gonna be a proper boot camp. Sign up here if you're willing to endure hell, if you really want results. Now, of course, I don't think we even need to comment on what we really think of such ideas. But in any case, what are we going to see if that individual has no fair chance? We're not going to see anything, but we are going to see frustration. So this is where you can link the endotoxemia status very tightly to heart rate variability. And yes, there are the occasional people whose cardiac behavior means that they don't quite get the accurate readings. Yes, there's those exceptions, but in the main, it's a really interesting metric to keep track of, because it gives us some realistic expectations as to, okay, you are not going to see any positive change in your weight loss goals until this reaches a more desirable zone. So we can gauge expectations and what our focus need be, but also we can do some before and after comparisons, as in, okay, what was the difference for the steps we took to balance neurotransmitters? What was the difference for that increased mitochondrial support? Was it a case that by taking away those mitochondrial shortages shown on your organic acids test, did that immediately see a change in your resources, which it should? Or were those resources immediately stolen by either the inflammatory response or the stress response? In which case, again, that's told us very useful information as to the questions we should now ask next to determine exactly what are the levers that we should be pulling here. So, yeah, it's a really simple measurement, but I offer that up because if we're just not tracking things, if we are assuming that the best program is going to deliver the best results, we're going to continue seeing the sort of results that we're seeing, and it's pretty miserable.
Mm. Yeah, I love you bringing up heart rate variability as a really helpful biomarker to kind of just monitor some of these things, because it is that, I think. It kind of gives you such valuable information about how we are living our lives, what we're doing, and how that's influencing one of arguably the best markers we have for sort of our resiliency from a psychophysiological perspective.
Hmm. It's such a useful measurement. I mean, it's interesting how it's correlated with insulin sensitivity. That's a pretty valuable measurement to track. It's correlated with changes in testosterone status. It can predict inflammatory markers. It can predict the amount of activity we will see in the medial prefrontal cortex if we were to then put these people into an fMRI scan. That's pretty cool, because when we ask people, like, how are you feeling? We may as well ask them, how much investment is going on in your medial prefrontal cortex right now? And I've never actually asked a human being that in reality, but that is essentially what we're saying. So, yeah, it's very, very relevant in regards to so many different areas of the body. But even without getting too technical as to the various mechanistic links going on there, there's a real simple takeaway in that your body is forced into disinvestment. It's forced into an economy mode if it doesn't have enough resources to run the show the way we'd like. And heart rate variability tells us if we're in that economy mode or not. And not only that, it's something that is going to give us an ongoing live feedback as to whether what we're doing is making a difference, which is really important, because it's very easy to come up with a specified list of, well, here's things that should make a difference to this particular individual. However, that's all well and good when it does, but on those occasions it doesn't. Well, now we've got feedback to tell us that it's either failed to launch because there's an additional blockage in that pathway that I need to go and determine what it is and then deal with it, or it's because it's switched on a pathway but it's unmasked theft of those resources downstream, or has simply created a new challenge elsewhere now that there's activity going through these various pathways. So yeah, it's great. And in short, 35 RMSSD and below, we're expecting that individual is in very much fight and flight. There isn't flexibility. Everything they're doing is fully committed to that survival. And in that zone, everything will be committed to, ensuring better likelihood of meeting future challenges. Turns out the more fat you have underneath your skin, well, that's an insurance policy against uncertainty and energy insecurity. It's really helpful when times are bad. But yeah, when times are good, it's simply something that's going to compromise your strength to weight ratio. It's going to make you less efficient and potentially add to an inflammatory burden. So yeah, the body sheds it when it doesn't want it. And we see that all the time. People work through the various stages, the layers at which they remove one obstacle each layer, and suddenly, while eating the exact same thing they've been eating for the last couple of years, whilst maintaining the exact same level of activity, because they've hit a certain threshold, suddenly they start losing fat. Day in, day out, they can visually see the difference. It's a really powerful and profound shift. And what's so interesting is that heart rate variability gives us an idea to predict when that's going to happen. So yeah, that's where I do think there's a good takeaway there, in that as much as the concept is simple and the reality involves changes that might not necessarily be very easy, we do have the means to know whether things that should work are going to work without having to invest 2 months of our life to see.
Sure. And if you're happy to share, do you have any sort of favorite products to use from an HRV tracking perspective?
So I think it would always come down to, yeah, where are we seeing those problems, and work back from there. So in regards to heart rate variability, ultimately that is a very accurate indication of the activity of your vagus nerve, the centerpiece of the parasympathetic nervous system, which is all about that rest and digest. And specifically, what's going on when we're measuring this is that whenever we breathe in, we are activating the sympathetic nervous system and our heart rate rises. And then when we breathe out, we are activating the parasympathetic nervous system and our heart rate drops. And that's something we'd expect to happen about 15 cycles every minute. But the interesting thing is that if there is this sympathetic dominance, that is to say, the parasympathetic system just isn't really getting a look in, we don't see the second half of those cycles. We don't see that drop. That is to say, there isn't the variability that we would expect. The heart rate just gets locked in that slightly higher mode. So that's what it's telling us. And of course, what impacts the activity of that vagus nerve? Well, that's constantly sensing the inflammatory burden, the energy signals, the stress impact. And so that's why, while it is incredibly useful, it's not automatically telling us that this is driven by stress or that is driven by a lack of mitochondrial activity. And so that's often where I would undertake that first appointment using the organic acids test, because everyone needs to take one before that initial appointment. And now we can marry that up against the case history, marry that up against the clinical picture that we're seeing, that day-to-day pattern. And suddenly it becomes clear that we've got some real obvious connections between the issues we picked up and the contribution that may well be having on stress response, on energy availability, and on that inflammatory cascade. So that's where I would always look at what are the obvious things? But just to give you some examples. So if somebody has had a whole lot of stress placed on them, whether that's life stress, emotional stress, inflammatory stress, or whether that's energy, whatever it is, we're going to have seen a lot of opening of that gut lining as a consequence. And that means a lot of endotoxins flowing in. And that means a whole lot of down regulation of various receptors, which includes that cortisol receptor and equally estrogen receptor alpha. So I wouldn't ever want to try and jump in to try and regulate the estrogen receptors first off, but maybe we should come back to that. But in that first round, regulating the adrenals can be one of the most powerful things that's available to us. This is because as long as there's been that long-term stress and there's been that down regulation of the cortisol receptors, we just can't expect the cortisol in the bloodstream to have an appropriate effect at the hypothalamus. And what does it do there? Its role is to dampen down the stress response. It's all about that negative feedback. And so this is where, again, we touched on it in the previous podcast, but we need to recognize that cortisol is very poorly phrased if we dub it the stress hormone, and instead best acknowledged as the hormone that helps us cope with stress, as well as turn off the stress response as soon as it's not necessary. But that doesn't happen if we've lost the sensitivity at those receptors, and that's where the stress response can get stuck in the on position, which means it's continually asking for more resources, which affects multiple areas of the body. But of course, to go back to that gut lining issue, it's going to continually open up the gut lining in search of those resources, and thus we got the endotoxins, and thus should these estrogen issues be a concern, it's going to be continuously pouring fuel on the fire. So yeah, that's where dealing with that stress response is very relevant. A very helpful item does tend to be licorice root. Licorice root increases the availability of cortisol at cellular level, and potentially Korean ginseng as a second step. Korean ginseng increases the sensitivity of those receptors, but it also tends to have a little bit more of a switch on effect in the brain, which is where often we need to just ensure there's decent resources before doing so, which is where, of course, we should focus on the mitochondrial performance, because if that's impaired, well, then it's going to be impaired everywhere there are mitochondria. That includes the hypothalamus. There's very elegant connections there that allow the hypothalamus to become extra responsive to any stressful stimuli if it's on low energy. And so this is where leaving those mitochondrial shortages unattended to, that's likely to leave us a lot more stressed than we need be. A lot more occasions when the system will mobilize those resources, redistribute them to areas that allow us to get ready, and ultimately remove them from detoxification, from digestion, from key areas of the immune system, as well as prefrontal cortex. So yeah, really big deal. But equally, if there's any mitochondrial issues, then there's likely going to be a slowdown in what the mitochondria can do, how much they can take out of the bloodstream. So yes, they're making less energy. That's not ideal, but also they're having to return some of it to the bloodstream, and they use the insulin receptor to do that. Specifically, they down regulate the sensitivity of that insulin receptor, and that's where insulin can have a further effect on estrogen too. Perhaps we'll talk about that. But yeah, to go back to your question, what are the key wins? Well, yes, anything that adequately addresses any challenges with cortisol signaling is likely to be particularly powerful. So to removing any blockages at the mitochondria. Equally, let's recognize the dual role of magnesium, both in supporting mitochondria, but also in helping us with sensory gating. All of our cells need to maintain some sort of resistance against a lot of the signals coming in. Otherwise, the whistling of the wind through the trees ends up signaling some sort of crisis that is akin to a tiger jumping out from behind a rock. And thus, this is why we need that sensory gating. Magnesium helps with that, helps silence these unnecessary inputs. So that tends to have a very reliable effect at bringing people down a notch, helping with sleep, which of course then means less adrenal activation the following day, less stress response is needed to compensate, and suddenly we've got an upward spiral in multiple ways. So yeah, adrenal support, mitochondrial support with magnesium in place, and equally if we see any obvious inflammatory triggers, maybe, yeah, that's dysbiosis. Maybe that's dental issues. Maybe that's mold exposure. Maybe that's allergies. Identifying and removing that is also something that's very reliable, very profound, and yeah, not only saves so much energy, because there are very few things as thirsty for energy as an activated immune cell. So it saves that theft, but equally saves on all that inflammatory activity, which means nitric oxide activity, which means a gas that competes with oxygen, which means starving your mitochondria, and further limitations on the energy supply. So yeah, that's where I'm never expecting anti-inflammatory herbs to do the job in the early stages. This is, the body is in a very different mode. It's not going to respond to these helpful but subtle support signals. But yeah, removing triggers is so key in those early stages. And yeah, PS, if there's mold, let's not pretend it's not a massive deal. I totally recognize how inconvenient and potentially costly that can be. But equally, the number of individuals, and this is we're into the hundreds now, the number of individuals with mold exposure who've achieved any substantial progress towards their goals before taking care of it, none. Doesn't happen. So yeah, as an inflammatory trigger, that would be yeah, pretty powerful. Certainly not the only one.
Yeah, absolutely. It comes back in some ways, if you wanted to keep it super simple, the idea of we need to remove the bad stuff and add the good stuff, and
Well, yeah, the concepts are simple.
yeah,
Sometimes the mechanics and the fitting it into real life is not, but yeah,
yes.
the concepts are.
Yeah, love the concepts. So a couple of things that I think you wanted to go back to. One was around sort of estrogen receptors, and I guess are there things that we know, for want of a better way of putting it, kind of directly modify this apart from everything that we've been discussing, and also the insulin piece of the puzzle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so insulin tends to have a number of effects there. So one of which is simply to potentially add to the anabolic effects that estrogen can have. So quite relevant when it comes to things like endometriosis or even acne. Whereby it's stimulating additional activity within those sebaceous glands that are so implicated. So yeah, it can have that additive effect, but equally, any sort of insulin sensitivity issues, they do seem very well placed to mess with the regulation of the menstrual cycle. At which point, if there's any lack of energy investment into that process at any point in those first phase of that follicular phase, typically days 5 to 13. If that's the case, then we cannot expect there to be sufficient signaling to induce successful ovulation. Now, that obviously has its implications if individuals are trying to get pregnant. But equally, even if they're not, then we're going to see that there isn't the release of that corpus luteum, the egg, and therefore it cannot interact with the endometrial lining, which is necessary for the progesterone production to occur in the way we'd like it to. So this is where we can end up with a lack of progesterone, and it's one of the most common imbalances that we're going to see. I'm not saying this is just insulin sensitivity issues that are involved here. As we've touched on, anything that limits the permission of resources given to these zones in the body can play a role there, and therefore all of those big factors we've touched on should be questioned. But yes, insulin is very effective in disturbing this process. And so, yeah, what happens when we have that low progesterone in the second half of the cycle? Well, there is less to balance out the effects of estrogen, but also you need progesterone to support effective activity of that estrogen receptor alpha. So that's a further means through which, yeah, not only is estrogen unopposed, but also the receptor profile is now tilted in favor of excessive switching on in these alertness linked zones of the brain, and excessive movement of energy into fat stores. So yeah, it's part of the way the body is designed that, yeah, when these signals interact, that, well, maybe what we're trying to do here is to conserve. So conserve we will. Maybe there's too much energy in the bloodstream, so let's take it out, put it into the fat cells. And this is where the fat storage, the gynoid pattern of fat storage, which is, yeah, buttocks and thighs, this is highly protective of the body. It takes that energy burden out of the bloodstream, away from the liver. This is the reason why Premenopausal women have such a distinct lower risk of cardiovascular disease, which all changes at the point of menopause when estrogen drops. So yeah, this is where, yeah, if it jiggles, it's generally protecting you, but not everybody wants jiggling. And so yeah, this is where that progesterone, that progesterone production, yeah, very very important to balance out total estrogen activity, support balance between those two receptors. But equally, it's important in itself, and especially in regards to mood and sleep. Progesterone has a very calming effect on the brain via the GABA receptors, the major inhibitory neurotransmitter of the brain. So yeah, that's a really big deal. So hopefully that outlines fairly how insulin can have direct impacts on what we're seeing, but often it's indirect yet vital impacts on the overall picture. So yeah, that's one of those factors that impact it. Other than that, yeah, we're mainly looking at yeah, that inflammation, regardless of how it's caused, but especially when endotoxins are involved, and yeah, the role of cortisol, which of course, as much as I mention it for all its benefits and its importance in taking somebody from that mobilized fight and flight state into a state of recovery, we must acknowledge that part of the recovery actually involves putting back what has been used up during the emergency. And whether that emergency has been going on 2 hours or 2 years or 2 decades, there's going to be a need to, you know, pay the cost and complete the stress cycle, complete the recovery. And the body won't feel recovered until it's got sufficient fat stores, energy insurance policies, so that it's better prepared for next time. I mean, that will change over time. You provide energy security for a few months, and suddenly the system will acknowledge that there's no purpose for this insurance policy, and thus it is shed. But yeah, that's where long-term stress means we've really only got the choice of adrenaline mode, where we're going to continually drive the costs, build them up, ensure that yeah, our tab is increasingly loaded up with further costs, or we can go into recovery mode. But no good fat loss is going to occur in either of those zones. And it's actually often once we meet the body halfway and give it that opportunity to complete the cycle, which includes doing what it needs to do to feel some energy security. That will involve some storage in the fat cells, and then following that, we can now move forward uninhibited and without those obstacles. That is to say, with a fair chance. And turns out that's all most people need.
I think that's brilliant, though. I think it, it's a really nice insight into how we think about these things. It's just, you know, you've got the specifics around with sorts of things, but you've also got to, as you said it towards the beginning, take that step back, and you've got to think about the body as a whole organism and the other things that can be having an impact within this kind of feedback loop. So I think you've done an amazing job of helping people see the bigger picture, but understand the complexity and the nuances of the specifics as well. So yeah, thank you very much.
So yeah, it's that nuance yet again, always is.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, is there anything that we haven't touched on that you want to cover?
Um, so I suppose yeah, it's probably worthwhile touching on menopause, because I think that yeah, that's often a subject that doesn't necessarily get the attention it deserves, and is another one that is subject to some dogma. And equally to look at the role of certain supplements, which we almost touched on earlier. And then equally, yeah, to look at any differences that we might want to consider for slightly different setups. So yeah, if I go through my thoughts on those. So in regards to menopause, obviously our aims are slightly different in that we're not trying to suddenly balance out the hypothalamus sensitivity on the basis that this will solve the problems, because it won't. If we're seeing any challenges as a result of that drop in estrogen, then that's where there is only one thing that's going to solve that in these circumstances, and that's replacing it. So traditionally, the option was take HRT or don't. And it was always something whereby certain women would do quite well with HRT and other women would do horrendously. And that's part of the one size fits all protocol for something as individual as hormones. It was something that couldn't possibly ever work out well for all, and sure enough, it didn't. But then, of course, yeah, there is the other route, which is becoming more popular in recent times, that of bioidentical hormones in doses that might actually suit the individual in question. Downside being that there is still some understandable concern over the use of hormones, most of which can be ameliorated. But and equally, then there's the cost of actually accessing that, because yeah, let's not kid ourselves that the NHS are suddenly going to start providing the sort of care that helps people. Yes, I went there. And then, yeah, the other option is the phytoestrogens. So this is where traditionally we've used red clover, soy, or sage, and they're all very well tried and tested items. We know what to expect, and they do have a lot of positive benefits. However, one thing that I'll repeatedly hear from women who are taking them is that, well, yeah, I do feel better. I have had some relief from hot flushes. There's some noticeable benefits, but I don't feel right. And a lot of this comes down to those very same receptors. So this is where all of these traditional phytoestrogens, they almost exclusively use the estrogen receptor beta. And that can be, yeah, particularly helpful in a whole lot of ways. We can expect that that will help switch on some of those alertness areas, and it makes sense as to why we'll often see women feeling better brain function as a consequence. But as you can imagine, there is very much a difference in how these supplements are impacting on metabolism and energy management versus what we want out of them. And that's because it's that estrogen receptor alpha that needs stimulating at the hypothalamus. Such an important part of the communication of the body to the brain to say, we've got the energy, go ahead and use it. And actually it works in concert with leptin in providing that permission, that signal that energy security has been achieved. Go ahead and do what needs doing, invest in what needs investing in, activate what needs activating. So yeah, use energy, and that's where the metabolic rate increases, as well as the fat cells responding to a similar tune, in that, well, clearly if everything is good, we don't need the insurance policy, take it. So that's where there's only one phytoestrogen I'm aware of that will actually have a decent effect on that estrogen receptor alpha, and that's hops. So there's normally some benefit from taking a hop supplement as it is. However, there are specific supplements that create the right extract, which is 8PN, 8 prenylnaringenin. That is the phytoestrogen in hops that does the business here. So that's where, although The research has been available for a long, long time. There's nothing new out there. One of those patterns that we consistently come up against in our field is that most practitioners are looking at, well, this expert says this expert says that, I'm going to pick her ideas, and then hope that they work out. But there isn't that stepping back and assessing, well, what options do we have here? Are we exploiting what's available? And hops is a perfect example of that. A lot of women will find that once they actually bring in a support like that, well, now for the first time, they're bringing back in some sort of estrogen receptor alpha activity, which hopefully, by continually stating its importance, I've conveyed what I think we need to focus on in these scenarios. So that's where, that would be one missing element to, a very common challenge that 50% of the population may end up facing. So that's something. In regards to supplements, hops can be useful, and often that can be helpful to reset that alpha signaling, even in premenopausal women. The key thing being that as long as there is that lack of energy usage, we may well find that there is a lack of energy investment in the gut. There may well be continued chaos there, increased opportunity for all of that inflammatory activity and the endotoxins that we mentioned, all of the stuff we desperately want to avoid, to give those estrogen receptors a chance. So sometimes several months of coming in, breaking a cycle by deliberately enhancing that receptor activity. Hops can play a role there as well. Other supplements, resveratrol, DIM, and calcium D-glucarate, I mentioned them earlier in a less than positive light, so it's fair that I look at the nuances there. So resveratrol, it's a really interesting supplement. It's one of the most fascinating in regards to its potential power to help mitochondrial biogenesis, specifically in pathways that are activated to help us respond to physical loading, so exercise adaptation. So very interested in its potential role there for performance enhancement and longevity, which is so interdependent on that mitochondrial performance and having sufficient numbers of healthy mitochondria. That being said, it is often held up as an aromatase inhibitor. An aromatase is the enzyme that turns testosterone into estrogen. So the idea being that if we use these aromatase inhibitors, most commonly resveratrol or mangosteen are offered up here, that will limit the estrogen in these cases of estrogen excess, estrogen dominance. But there's just one little problem: they just don't work. The body's regulatory systems are so much more powerful to overcome what is a well-proven but subtle effect. It's a perfect example of how just because a mechanism exists in the mammal research doesn't mean it's going to work on the front line when we bring in all of those burdens that we've accumulated as human beings in this complex world that places all manner of stresses on us and often rewards us for finding ways of dampening them down, so we don't even know how stressed we are and what's going on in the body. But I digress. Resveratrol doesn't work very well in those situations. DIM is a really interesting one, diindolyl methane. So where I would look to use DIM is to help with restoring expression of the NRF2 antioxidant response. So this is our primary cellular protective response, which should be activated whenever the cell is challenged in any sort of stressful manner, particularly when there's oxidative stress. And it's interesting how when we talk of milk thistle, curcumin, green tea, and all these antioxidant herbs, while there are some antioxidant compounds within them, their primary effect is as a pro-oxidant, an insult to the cells, which just so happens to stimulate a disproportionately good response from their NRF2 pathway. And thus, for most people, we're going to see a really good antioxidant response, but only if the NRF2 response is working the way we want. There's a number of things that can potentially impact on that, but mold exposure is by far and away the most devastating thing there. So often after people have had mold exposure, and we've removed the exposure through remediation or moving, and B, we've used binders to grab and remove any remnants. Some people will do fantastically. Other people will need a bit of rehab to bring back that antioxidant response to the level we want. That's where DIM can be very, very valuable. Although should be introduced slowly for obvious reasons. But yeah, this idea that, oh, it's great for estrogen detox. Well, it does have very well characterized effects on altering the pathways that are used to detoxify one particular type of estrogen, which is the estrogens, one of the three major subfamilies of estrogens. Now, for most people, that's not actually going to have any impact on what they're looking at, for reasons that hopefully I have conveyed. But so yeah, whilst there are benefits, and whilst it does impact on estrogen detox, most people aren't actually seeing the problems they're seeing because of challenges with that particular area of the detox pathway. So yeah, it's valid, but let's not extrapolate that excessively. Meanwhile, calcium D-glucarate, that does have very valuable effects should we see raised beta-glucuronidase in the gut. So if we do a stool sample, we see raised beta-glucuronidase. Well, that tells us that this is an enzyme that can rip open the packaged up toxins that the liver has put into conjugates, which can be seen as bin bags. The beta-glucuronidase interacts with that once this toxic chemical gets to the gut and rips open the bin bag, and then we have to reabsorb the toxin. The liver has to use its energy again to go through that same process, so it's super inefficient. Now, the key thing there is that often people look at this and think, well, estrogen is detoxified through glucuronidation, so therefore we can get more out by using calcium D-glucarate. Now, it's absolutely the case. I'd expect people to save tons of energy and get better detox responses if they're suffering with that issue I mentioned, that of bacterially induced rises in beta-glucuronidase. So yeah, absolutely very helpful to use in those circumstances. But if that's not part of the issue, then adding it in isn't going to do anything. And even if we see this very temporary drop in estrogen, even if that were to happen, well, guess what the hypothalamus does in response? It says, hey, where's my estrogen gone? And sends excess stimulation to the ovaries to compensate. And thus, we see the exact same patterns as we previously did. We're just spending £30 a month now on more supplements. So yeah, that's I think a decent lowdown of some of the supplements. And then finally, there's just one other estrogen related issue that can be worth touching on, that of low estrogen in premenopausal women. And this is almost always down to the body's attempts to go into economy mode and improve survival. That is to say, if it deems it hasn't got the resources to handle the challenges that it's facing, well, it's going to have to find them. And that means disinvesting in other areas. And there's a whole load of areas for which we'll see disinvestment, but one of the most noticeable is in that hypothalamic pituitary ovarian axis, which is just such a fantastic window into the underlying health of the woman. And of course, it's a monthly mirror to hold up in that regard. So yeah, when we're seeing a very dramatic drop in resources, that's when we can expect to see a dramatic drop in the investment into the ovarian axis, and suddenly, yeah, there's just not much estrogen available. So yeah, very, very common to see that if there is a lot of stress, that is to say, all the energy that is there is being diverted into those structures that help us get ready, but also when there is low calorific intake, which is endemic. Obviously, we must acknowledge the role of decades upon decades of programming that throw these ideas that if you cut 500 calories a day, you will lose 1 pound a week, which, given we're 160 years into since this idea was first launched, and still haven't seen a single long-term study showing its effect, despite tens of billions of research dollars trying desperately to find it, maybe we might need to acknowledge that there might be a flaw in that idea. And there are multiple flaws, but ultimately, yeah, this is where the estrogen, we can take short-term support. Obviously, there's a rationale for hops in that regard, but that's not going to be the solution here. What is going to be the solution is looking at, well, how much resources are coming in. Is there anything we can do to maximize those? That is to say, to ensure there isn't additional issues through shortages of the mitochondria, limiting activity, issues with insulin sensitivity that would otherwise exaggerate these problems, issues with inflammation that's a further drain on those resources. But yeah, often the most difficult thing there is not working out what to do. It's the switch on effect that occurs not only from providing the body with sufficient energy. Suddenly the brain is going to provide permissions to different zones that just wasn't happening, and the activation profile is so decidedly different. Equally, there's more investment in the gut. Maybe we're going to see some quite pronounced disturbances there. Equally, we can expect the immune system might suddenly feel capable of dealing with some of its most urgent tasks that were previously on a backlog. But equally, we'll see differences in the menstrual cycle, and we will always, by definition, see a temporary increase in weight to complete that stress cycle, at which point we are now free to actually get the sort of healthy weight management, easy weight management that has always been desired. But yeah, that's a very relevant thing to share, because it's something that in theory is easy to resolve, but in reality, is anything but easy to go through.
Amazing.
I'll take a breathe.
Yeah, breathe. No, that was fantastic. I think you've covered such important areas there, and you've gone deep into some of the mechanisms, and brought it back to kind of some actionable takeaways as well. So thank you once again for sharing your brain. I think it's
very welcome to it anytime.
It's going to be a popular episode, and I'm sure people reach out and give us some thoughts and feedback on this one. So thank you for your time.
Thank you for yours.
I think we'll have to schedule in our final episode that we always wanted to do. We had sort of 4 on the cards, and that's testosterone, so we can kind of go full circle in
do the set.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, well, we can't stop here. So I'll try and just give myself a little bit of a cushion as well, so that it's a bit more difficult for those others to take me off my current prime position in the podcast appearance list.
Brilliant. Marek, thank you very much, and we'll speak again on the podcast very soon.
Lovely. Speak to you soon.